And so I'd like to invite Louis Houlbrooke to our table from New Zealand Taxpayers Union. Louis.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Louis. I'm the campaigns manager at the New Zealand Taxpayers Union, so I'm here today to tell you to auction off the zoo animals. That was a joke.
Okay.
However, that could become the reality if every submitter to this council had their way in terms of some of their spending priorities.
Yep.
We, of course, come from a broader ratepayer perspective, and we are interested in the number 13.5, which is the proposed first-year rate hike under this budget. Now, this is, of course, followed by compounding rate hikes far above the rate of inflation year on year for a decade. And that is, of course, also on top of some of the country's highest commercial rates. From our perspective, this is actually a failure to recognise the sacrifices already made by businesses and households across the Wellington region in the wake of COVID-19. And of course, these rates costs are housing costs, and we are in a housing crisis. Surely the council should first do no harm when it comes to the housing crisis. We would argue that a 13.5 first-year rate hike is not a first do no harm approach. Now, 13.5% is not really 13.5% in this case, is it? Because in addition to this rate hike, we have a sludge levy, which is a great name for a levy, but we noticed it is a compulsory universal levy, so it is effectively a rate hike. So why is it not called a rate hike? Well, I think the council's been fairly upfront in its consultation, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's a way to appear on paper as though you are not exceeding your debt limit because you are using a special purpose vehicle. Now, I guess we'd ask councillors to reflect on the honesty of that proposal. And if you are determined to use a special purpose vehicle, we would at least ask you to be honest in your consultation material and to add the cost of that sludge levy onto the advertised rate hike so that ratepayers can see the real cost of what's being proposed. In terms of climate change initiatives, I'll just run through this very quickly. Central government sets the incentives to produce or to not produce emissions. It does this through the emissions trading scheme. Our concern is that initiatives that the council is proposing that go beyond the emissions trading scheme are actually redundant. Effectively, all you do when you take an initiative to reduce emissions locally under the ETS is you free up credits for people to produce more emissions in other parts of the country. We'd urge you not to duplicate central government's role in climate action. On the Central Library, and these comments I think apply to the council's other assets, there's a remarkable lack of choice in terms of the options in this consultation document on the Central Library. You would think in the context of a 13.5% rate hike, some form of privatisation would at least be on the table. We all know the politics of the library. We know that bookworms make really effective lobbyists, but the fact that it's not even on the table as an option in the consultation is frankly amazing to us, considering there are hundreds of millions to be saved, not just from abandoning the strengthening project, but actually selling that land that the library sits on. Now, if that's an alarming proposal, we'd suggest the councillors take a walk down to the street to one of our fantastic pop-up libraries. This could be a solution that is right under your nose. These pop-up libraries are successful, they are popular, they are dispersed, which makes them accessible, but crucially they are also scalable. When times get tough financially, you can reduce your expenditure on the pop-up library program, and vice versa when you actually have funds to spare. This same principle could be applied to some of the council's other assets. Take the council buildings at Civic Square, which are being proposed for demolition. Now, Civic Square, as it stands, is a wonderful place to go to if you want to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, because it's dead, it's a wasteland. That's not what a Civic Square should be about. By freeing up that land for commercial operators, you wouldn't only be raising millions and millions for the council to rein in those rate hikes, you'd also potentially be injecting a bit of much needed life and energy and commerce into that Civic Square. Again, that same principle can be applied to other property assets held by the council. In fact, we would look at parks. Mount Victoria, why not have some hospitality on Mount Victoria? That would be fantastic. Central Park, How about injecting some much-needed light and people into that currently relatively seedy location with a bit of commerce? Maybe it could be a food truck, or maybe you could actually allow a hospitality operator to set up there on a semi-permanent basis. Again, this is creative ways of raising revenue, creative ideas that should be on the table. We don't need to necessarily auction the zoo animals. Finally, let's look at the wider property portfolio of the council, just quickly rattle through them. We haven't discussed the town hall, we have discussed the library. The new convention centre is going to provide an enormous amount of venue space, which should lead to some kind of rationalisation of the other venues owned by the council. We're talking about the St James, the Opera House, the Michael Fowler Centre, Shed 6, TSB Arena. Really, how many venues does a council need to own? Because we would argue that the role of a council is to provide services, not to manage property assets. It is our view that councils do not make effective property managers because of the political incentives that they are subjected to, and we've seen this through the angst around making a rational decision on the future of the library. Also, the extent of the council's property portfolio exposes ratepayers to extraordinary risk. In the case of, for example, the big one, a big earthquake, the larger the property portfolio is, the more risk is fielded by ratepayers. So there's tremendous scope for rationalisation, privatisation, God forbid, but certainly monetisation of these assets. Finally, the council's most spectacular asset is probably its waterfront. But it's overlooked, it's taken for granted. A few food trucks here and there, that's nice, but maybe more substantial arrangements could be made to lease this space to hospitality and raise some revenue and cut that obscene 13.5% rate hike. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. We do have some questions. So, Councillor, I think it's Councillor Panic, Councillor Condi and Councillor Paul. And if they're brief, we'll probably get through all of them.
Yes. Hey, thanks, Louis. I appreciate you coming in. And look, this is a genuine question. How do you consult with rate and taxpayers all over the country? And is it compulsory to belong to your union, given everyone is a taxpayer? I am genuinely confused, so I'd just like some clarification.
Sure. Like most unions, membership of the Taxpayers Union is voluntary. We've got 50,000 subscribed supporters. Of those, about 2,000 have donated to us in the last year. When someone signs up for the Taxpayers Union, they're signing up to our mission of lower taxes, less waste and more transparency. So we're very clear that these are the values that we stand for. Any taxpayer is encouraged to join their local Taxpayers Union. So far there's one.
Okay. So do you consult with people?
We consult with our members, yes, we survey them every year.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Conti.
Thanks. Kia ora, Louis. One of the things you talked about was that rates rises have been significantly above inflation in the past, and I think you must be referring to CPI inflation, Consumer Price Index in that case.
Yes.
And I guess, you know, one of the things is council delivers infrastructure primarily, and when we had our water infrastructure revalued recently, it was revalued up 30% over 33 years, which says that the inflation rate on that infrastructure was 10% per year. So I guess I would be interested in your view about how we're supposed to reconcile. We're not a consumer, we are a major infrastructure provider.
Yeah, this might be a philosophical conversation because there's a concern that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more that councils are willing to spend on services that are perceived as council services, the more inflation that there is. However, we do take your point that there may be a legitimately higher level of inflation for some services.
I've certainly heard that. Right, so...
yeah, I just had a question.
Councillor Paul.
Yeah. Hey, Kia ora, thank you for the submission. Do you guys have a stance on congestion charging or water metering?
Yeah, we're not opposed to congestion charging at all. The obvious condition we would apply is that it's not used as a revenue raising tool. Congestion charging should simply be about managing congestion rates. We'd be interested to see what the central government has to say about that because they could offset that revenue with reductions in excise tax on fuel. Water metering? Broadly in favour of water metering.
That's been very interesting and certainly a perspective we haven't heard a lot of, so it's really useful to hear these perspectives that you brought to the table. Thank you.
Seriously, sell those zoo animals.